For centuries, indigenous communities thrived on deeply rooted connections to their land, ancestors, and spiritual beliefs. However, the arrival of European colonizers brought a new system of control, dismantling traditional ways of life. This video explores how the birth certificate became a powerful weapon in the colonial arsenal, systematically erasing Aboriginal identity. By replacing traditional markers of belonging with state-issued documents, colonial authorities aimed to dismantle indigenous sovereignty. The seemingly simple act of recording a birth became a tool of dispossession, severing ties between individuals and their ancestral heritage. The loss of language, culture, and self-determination can be traced back to these early acts of colonial control. Black Aboriginal people who have a unique cultural heritage were also profoundly affected. Their identities were often erased or misclassified, further complicating their struggle for recognition and rights. Before European colonizers, indigenous communities flourished with a profound sense of identity, deeply intertwined with their natural surroundings, ancestral lineage, and spiritual beliefs. This identity was a tapestry woven from the threads of community, kinship, and a sacred connection to the land. Their connection to the land was one of stewardship, recognizing their responsibility to protect and honor its delicate balance. Language served as a vital conduit, transmitting ancestral wisdom, stories, and traditions across generations. It was through language that indigenous communities maintained their cultural continuity. Spiritual beliefs, often rooted in the natural world, provided a framework for understanding their place within the interconnected web of life. These beliefs guided their interactions with the environment, their relationships with one another, and their understanding of the cosmos. This spiritual grounding fostered a deep sense of purpose and belonging. The arrival of European colonizers brought a new concept of identity, rooted in individualism, written documentation, and state control. The introduction of birth certificates became a powerful tool in the colonial project of assimilation and control. Prior to colonization, indigenous communities had their own sophisticated systems of kinship and belonging. Identity emerged organically from within the community through shared language, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs. The imposition of birth certificates disrupted these traditional systems, replacing them with a state-sanctioned version of identity. Birth certificates emphasized individuality over communal belonging, separating individuals from their kinship networks. This fragmentation served the interests of the colonizers, making it easier to control and exploit indigenous populations. Paper genocide, reclassification, and erasure of indigenous peoples. The introduction of birth certificates paved the way for a more insidious form of cultural erasure: paper genocide. This term refers to the systematic practice of using bureaucratic tools to reclassify indigenous peoples, stripping them of their tribal identities. By changing a name, a birth date, or a racial classification on a piece of paper, colonial authorities could effectively erase an entire lineage. One common tactic was the reclassification of indigenous peoples into broader racial categories, such as colored or Negro. The practice of removing children from their families and placing them in government-run boarding schools further compounded the damage. These schools sought to strip indigenous children of their language, culture, and spiritual beliefs. This deliberate erasure of identity had devastating consequences, leading to a loss of cultural knowledge and a profound sense of historical trauma. The case of Walter Ashby Plecker, systematic erasure in Virginia. Walter Ashby Plecker, head of the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Virginia from 1912 to 1946, offers a chilling example of paper genocide. Driven by racism and a belief in white supremacy, Plecker implemented policies designed to erase the presence of Native Americans from the state's official records. Plecker's obsession with racial purity led him to target Virginia's Native American populations for systematic erasure. Under Plecker's direction, the Bureau of Vital Statistics began altering the racial classifications on birth certificates, changing Indian to colored or Negro. This stripped them of their tribal recognition, making it difficult to assert their treaty rights or pass down their cultural heritage. Plecker's actions had a profound impact, effectively erasing the presence of Native Americans from Virginia's official records. Birth certificates as contract subjugation under state jurisdiction. Beyond cultural erasure, birth certificates have been interpreted as tools of legal subjugation, transforming individuals into subjects of the state. This perspective argues that registering a birth with the government creates an implicit contract, placing the individual under state jurisdiction. By accepting a birth certificate, individuals are arguably relinquishing their claim to their inherent rights as members of sovereign nations. The use of legal names on birth certificates further reinforces this notion of contractual obligation. This transformation from a living being with inherent rights to a legal entity subject to state control represents a significant erosion of indigenous sovereignty. Birth certificates serve to legitimize the colonial claim over indigenous lands and resources. The systematic erasure of Aboriginal identity was not a random series of events, but a calculated strategy by colonial governments. In the early 20th century, policies like the Indian Act in Canada and the White Australia policy aimed to assimilate indigenous populations into the colonial framework. These policies were designed to strip indigenous peoples of their cultural identities, languages, and traditional practices. In the United States, the Dawes Act of 1887 divided communal tribal land into individual allotments, undermining the communal landholding system that was integral to many indigenous cultures. This act aimed to dissolve tribal sovereignty and integrate indigenous peoples into the American capitalist economy. The residential school system further enforced this assimilation, forcibly removing indigenous children from their families and communities to indoctrinate them with European values and languages. In Australia, the Stolen Generations policy saw indigenous children taken from their families to be raised in white institutions or foster homes. This policy, which lasted from the late 19th century to the 1970s, was justified under the guise of providing better opportunities for these children, but effectively sought to erase their indigenous identities. These policies were not isolated incidents but part of a broader colonial agenda to control and assimilate indigenous populations. The introduction of birth certificates, with their emphasis on legal names and state registration, was another tool in this strategy, further entrenching colonial control and erasing indigenous identities. Through these policies and actions, colonial governments sought to dismantle the social, cultural, and spiritual fabric of indigenous communities, paving the way for the continued exploitation of their lands and resources. Digging deeper into the historical context, we uncover the personal stories and testimonies that bring these policies' devastating impacts to life. Meet Mary, an Indigenous elder from Canada. She recounts the anguish of being taken from her family at the tender age of 6 and placed in a residential school. Mary's voice trembles as she describes the loss of her native language and the harsh punishments for speaking it. "They told us our language was savage," she recalls, "but in it were the songs of our ancestors, the stories of our creation." In Australia, we hear from John, a member of the Stolen Generations. He was removed from his family at age 4 and placed in a white foster home. "I was given a new name, a new identity," John says, "but I always felt like a stranger in my own skin." His eyes well with tears as he describes the lifelong search for his biological family, a quest that many in his generation share. Moving to the United States, we learn about the experiences of the Lakota Sioux people under the Dawes Act. Tribal historian Sarah explains how the division of communal lands fractured their community. "We were farmers and hunters living off the land together," she explains. "The Dawes Act turned us into isolated landowners, breaking the bonds that held us together." These personal stories highlight the profound emotional and psychological toll of these historical policies. They serve as a poignant reminder that behind every policy and statistic lies a human story of loss, resilience, and the unyielding quest for identity. These testimonies underscore the deep wounds inflicted upon indigenous communities, wounds that continue to affect generations. They remind us that the erasure of indigenous identity was not just a policy, but a lived experience, one that has left an indelible mark on the hearts and souls of those who endured it. The spiritual fallout, disconnection, and loss of identity. The erasure of indigenous identity through birth certificates and other colonial practices has had a devastating impact on the spiritual well-being of indigenous communities. Traditional indigenous names often carry deep spiritual significance, reflecting ancestral connections or personal characteristics. The replacement of these names with European ones severs a vital link to ancestral knowledge and spiritual identity. The loss of language further exacerbates this spiritual dispossession, as language is the repository of cultural memory and spiritual beliefs. The suppression of indigenous languages has resulted in a loss of access to traditional knowledge systems and spiritual practices. This fragmentation affects not only the present generation, but also future generations who inherit the legacy of cultural and spiritual dispossession.